This is College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a weekly program exploring the lives and work of the people of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College.
Well, one of the things that we see happening these days is with all this media fuss about the political environment in which we live, is this issue of journalism getting into politics getting into journalism. And also, it becomes especially sensitive when we're talking about academics and getting into the whole thing, because we're supposed to have our own standards of how to do things. So to talk about these issues, we have invited you today. It's Professor Andrea Gabor, who is a native from the Windy City in Chicago, Illinois. She got her bachelor's in arts from Wesleyan University, that's in Connecticut, and in German and government, so talking about politics, and a master's in journalism from Columbia University here in New York City. Today she's a Bloomberg professor in the Department of Journalism and Writing Professions at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences in Baruch College, City University of New York. Welcome to College Talk.
Thanks so much. It's delightful to be here.
Thank you. Well, my first question to you is, because reading your resume, of course, I was surprised to see that you were in German and government and suddenly jumped to journalism. Okay. What happened there?
What happened? Well, it really goes back to the Windy City in Chicago. When I was growing up, one of our close family friends was a larger-than-life man who, and keep in mind this is the 60s and the early 70s, who had been the founding editor of Ebony magazine. And this was, of course, during the Civil Rights era, and he was actually, he was Jewish, he was a member of the Communist Party, and therefore the only place he was able to get a job back in the day was at the Chicago Defender, which was a black publication, and then Ebony magazine. So long story short, I grew up on his stories about journalism and civil rights, and became fascinated. And of course, that was also the Watergate era, which influenced many journalists of my generation. And so, of course, I went and got a good liberal arts education, but I was very interested in journalism, although my family, like many families, tried to discourage me, but that's where the roots of my interest really took hold.
Yes, because at that time, virtually all journalists were males. In fact, many people refer to the journalists, the press boys. The press boys,
yes.
Remember?
Yes, well, we changed that.
Yes. Good, and today that has changed dramatically, actually. That's very good. Looking at your resume, though, I see you have kind of deep into different areas, different aspects of the world. And one of the titles of your book, or one of your books, is The Capitalist Philosophers, the Geniuses Who Shape Modern Business. So we're talking about here economics, talking about philosophy in many ways, and talking about business. Right. What interests you of doing this confluence of things that you say, well, is kind of different from what most people do? Okay.
Well, that's interesting. So like many business journalists, I backed into business journalism. I sort of fell into it. And my first big break came when I went to work for Business Week, where I covered corporate strategy, I covered technology. And back in those days, I remember one of the first stories I did was about General Motors' CEO decided that he could probably replace many of those pesky auto workers, those unionized auto workers who were causing all those problems with auto competitiveness with robots. And so I did this big story about this great new robotic strategy. Well, you know how far that went. And of course, at around that time, gradually there was the realization that, pesky auto workers really weren't the problem. The problem in Detroit and in the auto industry was American management. So I ended up actually, from having backed into business journalism, I backed into covering the workplace and management. And before I wrote the book that you referenced, I actually wrote a book on a man named W. Edwards Deming, who I think, and not just me, was one of the most important management thinkers of the 20th century. And he really brought together He was he was a physicist and a statistician, and he married that very sort of scientific approach and that those scientific credentials with this humanistic approach to management. And one of his great insights was that the only way to really improve organizations is by getting knowledge from the grassroots, from the people closest to the process. And management's job is to make that knowledge actionable. In other words, to find how do you train employees to identify problems in the system and then to improve the system, and how do you, in organizations that are suffused with fear and oftentimes very dysfunctional cultures, how do you get low-level people to bring their knowledge to bear? And so this was really a marrying of scientific management, which America gave birth to through Frederick Winslow Taylor on the one hand, and on the other hand, the much more humanistic strain of management. And so I found this absolutely fascinating, and those two themes are very prominent in the capitalist philosophers, and actually Deming's influence on me has sort of continued, and my upcoming book, which is actually on education reform, and believe it or not, even that is in many ways influenced by business thinking, is also informed by Deming's insights about systems and improvement.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask you about that because the title of that book that you referred to is The Man Who Discovered Quality. How W. Edward Deming brought the quality revolution to America. And the reason why I wanted to ask you about that is that despite his ideas that were implemented by some, the fact of the matter is a lot of people complain about the quality of many American products to the way that we have been outcompeted by other nations in those processes. So I guess my question is, did we actually learn the lesson and apply it, or just some of us learn that lesson and then competitors actually are applying our own solutions to those problems?
Oh, that's a very complicated question. So we did learn. We actually did learn the lesson. The U.S. went from being completely beaten by the Japanese to actually kind of reviving its operations and its creativity and so forth. But we're a very short-term oriented culture. And so we tend to forget things very quickly and then to have to reinvent the wheel. So, for example, in Detroit, the CEO of Ford was instrumental in bringing Deming to Detroit. Once Don Peterson retired, they sort of forgot about what had happened. And so I went back to Detroit actually about a decade after Deming had first gotten there to do a story about Ford discovering quality. And what Ford was doing a decade later was literally reinventing the wheel and rediscovering a quality approach that was now being packaged and marketed by General Electric. It was called Six Sigma. And many of those lessons had their roots in what Deming was doing. So yes, we've learned the lessons. Yes, those ideas continue to be embedded in some of the kind of best, in fact, in some ways, I've often wondered about how Deming would have reacted to the open source software movement, because that is the quintessential example of good ideas percolating up from wherever they come and being made actionable, right? But we are a short-term oriented culture, and we constantly have to reinvent the wheel.
To what extent do you think that this obsession with maximizing profit has hurt the quality? Because sometimes they think about the very short term that you just mentioned, and they want to make as much money as possible so they can impress their shareholders of the company. While you see, for example, in other countries that it's not that obsession with that profit margin. In Japan, for example, talking about the auto industry, if your car needs to be serviced or has to get some repair, they come to your home to pick it up and then return it to your home when that happens. Right. I mean, that's quality service. Right. We don't see that kind of things in this country. I mean, look at the airline industry, for example. Yes, got deregulated. Yes, it's cheaper, but the quality that we are receiving as passengers is horrible in comparison with any other country. So can we explain that kind of contradiction?
Yeah, well, I think it's short-termism, absolutely, and it's something that Deming talked about a lot. But it's also it's the marketing culture. It's the idea of always you have to constantly be selling something new. And I really do believe it is an undervaluing of people and the people experience. So many of those examples you mentioned, whether it's the airline industry or whether it's telecom. I mean, one of my bugaboos, I haven't written about this yet, but maybe I will, is when you finish any process, in any business transaction, they ask you to take a survey. Short survey, 1 question, 3 questions. What are those survey questions about? Those survey questions are never about the system. They're never about the process. They're never about the fact that Verizon, still doesn't have DSL lines throughout New York City, that they are not maintaining their copper cable, that they have, terrible service. Those surveys are always about the, poor guy or gal on the other end of the phone who's trying their best to meet your needs, but they're not in charge of the system, right? So the companies aren't interested in how do you really feel about the system as a whole. It's always about the worker. Let's rate the worker.
Yes.
Let's beat up on the worker, and that's all they really care about.
Not only that, but I feel when I receive those surveys that you are working for the company instead of the company working for you.
Right.
So the other thing is, about talking quality, I saw a documentary the other day on public television about how many electronic companies actually generate products that have a life time that is very short. Like kind of after 3 years, you better buy another printer. By the way,
it's
from
called
us.
Planned obsolescence. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I wonder is how on earth they are getting away from that, because on one hand they are deceiving the public because you don't expect that by buying a printer you have to replace it in 3 years, and also to what extent is also our fault as a consumer not to be better informed and more critical of such practices.
Well, I think you're raising a really good point because, it really is all about marketing, right? And so you may have a perfectly functioning piece of electronic equipment. And, if you're like me, it takes me so long to learn how to use some of this stuff. I don't want to replace it. Or in the case of my my word processing software, I love the configuration from 2008, and I don't want the 2016 or 17 version, right? So the consumers have to become much more savvy about the fact, and it's also an environmental issue. Why do we need to replace our cell phones every 2 years? Does that extra new app, that extra new configuration really make a difference? And why does every time you get a new phone, the plugging mechanism change? So that all those cords you have are now obsolete, right? So some of this is a question of consumers just having to become much savvier.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's jump now to another topic because we could spend the entire half hour just about these issues. And it has to do with the title of another book that you wrote called Einstein Wife. Work and Marriage in the Lives of 5 Great 20th Century Women.
Yes.
Please tell us, to the general audience, what this book was all about.
Oh, gosh. Well, Einstein's Wife really started with that idea about there was a big news story when it emerged that there had been these passionate love letters between Albert Einstein and his first wife, Mileva, And suddenly people said, well, who was this Mileva Maric, right? She was this sort of the forgotten wife. And it turns out, of course, that she had been a physicist, a fellow student of Einstein's, and there was the suggestion that perhaps she had helped to write the theory of relativity, which was a completely overblown suggestion, although she was helpful to him in many ways.
As a sounding board, people say mostly.
Well, as a sounding board, but she actually probably helped him with calculations. I mean, there's some evidence that she was more than just an intelligent sounding board, but she did not write the theory of relativity. But in any event, that got me thinking about sort of in the 20th century, as you were mentioning earlier, how many women journalists were there in say the 60s and early 70s. This was sort of the first generation of women during the 20th century who had the prospect or the opportunity to have a professional life. And I was sort of interested. At the time I was newly married. I had just had my first child. What was that balance like for that first generation of women? So I profiled a group of very accomplished women, all of whom were married, and looked at how they had fared. And I started with Mileva Maric, and my last profile was of Sandra Day O'Connor, the Supreme Court Justice.
Yeah. Well, I think the case of Mileva Maric was really interesting for a number of reasons. Most people don't realize that at the turn of the 20th century, women were not allowed in most universities.
That's absolutely right. And in fact, Mileva Maric she was Serbian. She had to go to Switzerland to go to university. Her very famous predecessor, Marie Curie, had to go to Paris. There were literally, you could count on one hand the number of universities in Europe where an intelligent female scientist could go and study.
It's funny because most people accuse institutional higher education of being too liberal or too politically correct. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is the history is not on that side.
It's not on that side.
Because not only women, they're Jews or blacks, or they were even not official but under the table quotas for people like that.
Absolutely.
That they imposed just because they were different. And that made the life for those people really, really difficult.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And not only that, but in the case of the first Einstein's wife, the second was basically his cousin. They had a child that they kept in secret pretty much, and probably she died in infancy. That all this was discovered through all those letters that you mentioned. So add all those personal issues to the professional ones. And then, to be frank with you, I think she was really mistreated by Einstein in the last years of their marriage, when he wrote that famous memo to her telling her, you are not to talk to me without my permission, you are not going to enter my office, you are going to prepare my dinner. I mean, this goes beyond the image that most people have of Einstein, that a very jovial guy, very nice guy. That was
benevolent, tousle-haired scientist. Yeah. But even more so, they had a son who was schizophrenic.
Yeah.
And as is often the case with schizophrenia, that schizophrenia emerged when he was a teenager. And by that time, their marriage was on the rocks. They end up getting divorced, of course, and Einstein comes to the United States. Mileva Maric stays in Europe. And I now do not recall at what point Einstein never saw his son again, but basically he left his ex-wife to care for, and she actually devotes the rest of her days to trying to keep this young man who's in and out of mental institutions, together in some ways. And it was very, very tragic. And there are many bad husbands and many bad marriages, but I think probably the greatest indictment on Einstein's character is really the treatment of his mentally ill son.
Yeah. Not only that, I think he was so desperate of getting away from his wife and the children, was the fact that he basically promised her the money from the Nobel Prize, which it's a lot of cockiness to say something like that, like saying, "I give you this money, leave me alone, so you don't have to ask me for money anymore." So I mean, it was really, really nasty.
Well, but I think you could look at that more charitably as well, which is that they never had much money, and that she did have to care. This young man was in and out of very expensive mental institutions his entire life. And I think that was actually the right thing to do. So, yes, was it a way to kind of, wash his hands of the matter? Yes, but he did, at the end of the day, provide her with the means that she needed to help support this son.
So based on this conversation and the title of your book, you think that she was actually a great woman?
Oh, I think more than any other woman in the book, she was a tragic woman. She was a woman with tremendous potential, who was mistreated by her professors, as well as eventually her husband. And she never overcame those obstacles. The other women in the book do overcome the obstacles that they face.
Okay, now let's change to another topic.
A happier topic.
We could go on all these topics. So anyhow, and I wanted to ask you about this: is the issue of academics as journalists or journalists as academics. My guess is that this must be a tough job these days, and the reason is that professors are supposed to be balanced in their classes, not trying to influence the students in any way. But obviously, with the kind of news that we are living today, or the fake news of the alternative facts, whatever you want to call it, I'm sure that you in class get a lot of questions from the students about this, because the press has become a protagonist, has become a target, has become a way through which people want to have their belief confirmed. So it must be a really tough job for you guys.
Well, I would put it slightly differently, which is I think this is the most important work we could do right now. And this actually relates to the most recent book that I'm writing about, which has to do with education reform. Because, that's a long story, but we have escalated the nuclear testing arms race to such an extent in schools that civics is completely neglected. And so we go into the classroom here, and students very often don't read the newspaper. They are overwhelmed with what they're hearing on television. They don't have a clear sense of civics and the role of the First Amendment or even the founding of this country. And of course, our founding fathers most of them were journalists, interestingly. And so I've actually had students say to me in class this semester for the first time, we're talking about a story in the paper, especially about our new president, and they'll say, well, but the president said whatever that is, that there's rioting in Sweden, or that, Muslims are whatever. And if the president said that, or that, Barack Obama, wiretapped his phones, how, and the New York Times says that's not true, how do we know? How are we supposed to make sense of that, right? So then it becomes our job, to talk about what is a credible news story. What are the kinds of sources you expect to see in a credible news story? How is data used to back up the story? How is the evidence used, right? So it's a very different process teaching that today in the era of Trump and fake news, but I think it's more important than ever.
So I guess that takes me to my next question is, are we doing a good job teaching critical thinking? Because, there are two ways of seeing that. All the students have to take a critical thinking course in the philosophy department, who are usually the ones who teach that. Or others say, well, critical thinking should be an important component of every single course that we teach, which sometimes finds resistance because some people say, well, I'm just here to teach the facts. Okay. What's your view on that?
Okay. Oh, wow. Well, first of all, again, I have to take it back to K through 12 education, which is my current obsession. And the problem there is, and this, I'm going to tie it together, is that public education in this country is under assault, okay? And what we've had is, again, a very business-minded regime arguing that, teachers are terrible, public schools are terrible, and imposing these testing regimes. And there's a great deal of pressure to teach to the test. And so we are getting, very often bright young students out of high schools who haven't been taught civics, haven't been encouraged to read the newspaper, have not been encouraged to engage in freewheeling, conversation, debate about the issues of the day, let alone how they relate to our history, right? So that's the students those are the students we're dealing with here at Baruch College. And so absolutely we have to deal with critical thinking. Now you can't do that in a vacuum. You can't do that devoid of facts. Of course not, okay? You have to teach history and philosophy and civics and literature and all those things. Nor do you necessarily, or should you be taking a particular point of view, but you have to teach students how to recognize point of view because we're all humans. I mean, one of the things that I argue in journalism classes, and this is a little bit unorthodox for a journalist, is, there really is no such thing as quote-unquote objective news, right? Because we all filter the news. Every journalist filters it through their own experience. Yeah. So the job of a journalist is to be fair and to try to get to the truth. And what I tell my writing students is, if you approach a story from here at the beginning, and you don't end up over here at the end, you haven't done your job. Because what you learn through really rigorous reporting will inevitably change your view of the story. And I think that's true of academics as well. You have to teach students how to think about this great and rich world of information and literature and history and philosophy out there.
Okay. Well, I had many more questions for you, but we ran out of time. Meaning this conversation was really good. I'm sure our audience will appreciate it as well.
Great.
And so thank you for
for
coming to the show. And next week we're going to have Dr. Rebecca Spoconi of the Department of Natural Sciences here at the Weissman School, who will be talking about the chemistry of life. So stay tuned.
Sounds fascinating. Great. Thank you very much.
This has been College Talk with Dean Aldemaro Romero Jr., a production of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences at Baruch College. All rights reserved, 2017.